Weiss, CTO of Ratchetsoft. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the Ratchet-X start by scenarios. Now this should help us understand the various ways that Ratchet-X actions can be started and should help us in picking the right way for our specific use case. The first and most popular is start by mapping. Now the interface for this is start by mapping. This is the most common scenario in which Ratchet-X identifies one or more X model mappings that are found on a RegWin. The user can then select a specific mapping either by magic button drop-down or through a shortcut key or a shortcut mouse action. In this scenario, the action is started and it's passed a mapping info object. Now this object can be used to access a set of data, which is the X model, in an abstract way and not have any knowledge of the specific app space details. This method allows a loose coupling between action and app space, and it affects a one action to many app space solution. Next we have start by RegWin. This interface is start by RegWin. In this scenario, there is a one-to-one relationship between an action and an app space. And the action itself has to have working knowledge of the app space's RegWins, snippets, clickets, etc. In cases where the action need only work with one app space, this is the best solution. The action will be started and passed a RegWin info object, and this object can be used to access all the components of the RegWin and the app space it resides within, thus giving you the ability to access potentially other RegWins within that app space. This is often a good choice when you're building an action that is doing something specific to a application screen. Like, for example, it's doing manual data entry into a certain piece of software or something. In that case, where the action itself is inextricably linked to the application that it's working on, then there's no need for any loose coupling, and start by RegWin is the best answer. The next is start by Snaggle. Now this interface is start by Snaggle. In this scenario, there is no app space at startup. The action must supply one or more regular expressions that will be used to identify patterns of text, like phone numbers or account numbers, on any application window. The user invokes the snaggling by clicking a hotkey that's configurable, and Ratchet-X will then scrape the text from the screen, and it attempts to identify the text patterns using the regexes provided. If found, the user is shown the matches and they select one. The action will then be started and passed a Snaggle info object. This object contains the text that was selected, its screen location, and other regex specific information that might be usable by the action author. Now, once started, the action is free to open any app spaces it may require. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that Start by Snaggle doesn't use an app space. If the intention is to snaggle data to start your action and then open up some other screens and do data entry or something, obviously you can access the app spaces manually once you're inside your action. Next we have Start by File. This interface is start by File. Now in this scenario, again, there is no app space at startup. The action is started by the user drag and dropping a file onto the action itself within the Ratchet-X Commander user interface. So in this case, the action will be started and it will be passed the file names of the file or files being dropped. And then, of course, once started, the action is free to open any app spaces that it may require. Now, we've used this scenario in a number of cases where a user wants to drag and drop something, maybe an email document, onto an action to start it, and then the action itself will parse through the email document and maybe do data entry into a specific system, in which case it's free to open up any app spaces that it needs to get at the RegWins that it would require for that action. But again, this is a scenario where there is no app space at startup. It's triggered by an event other than a RegWin being recognized. And lastly, we have Start by User. Now this is the interface Start by User. In this scenario, there is no app space at startup again. And the action is started by the user manually executing the action from within the Ratchet-X Commander user interface by selecting Execute from the Actions context menu. Okay? So once again, this action is free to open any app spaces that it may require, but when it's first run, when it's started, there are no RegWins or app spaces that have triggered that execution, so it's up to the action author to open any app spaces that it may require. Okay, so our mission for today is to create an auto dialer for Skype that will dial phone numbers contained within RegWins, mappings, Snaggle scrapes, and files, and therefore using all of the available Ratchet-X Start By interfaces, all within one action. This will allow us really to highlight the difference in each. It will be one action that we write that will perform only one service, which is to call the Skype soft phone's dialer and dial out a phone number, but it will be started different ways. So we really should get a solid understanding of the differences between each one of these Start By scenarios. So let's code. Okay, to start off with, we have Ratchet-X loaded. It's sitting here in the system tray. It's in development mode. And we've got the action editor loaded. Let me choose File New. As always, when you start a new action, Ratchet-X offers you a list of action templates, and you'll notice that those relate to the specific Start By scenarios. Our first Start By scenario we will cover is Start By mapping. So I'll select that template. And Ratchet-X opens up your action, and it includes for you automatically the Start By mapping section, or region, and the Start By test region. Now, Start By test is a Start By scenario that the scenario is really only for testing here within the app space, within the action editor itself. So every one of the templates all include Start By test so that you can test your action here in development mode. But Start By mapping is actually the Start By scenario that we're going to be covering now. Let me open it up. You'll see that Start By mapping, when we say that our action will implement Start By mapping, we really mean that our action will implement I Start By mapping. Now, to implement I Start By mapping, you need to provide a method called Start By mapping, which receives an action context and a mapping info object. And that method, as all Start By scenarios, all the Start By methods always return an action result. With Start By mapping, you also have a required mappings property. In this case, your required mappings needs to provide a URL to whatever X model you're using. And obviously it's a string array, so you can be using multiple X models. And you could even be using a wildcard. If you just put a star for that, or an asterisk, it would just allow you to attach to, essentially, offer your action for virtually any X model. Got to be careful there, but it is a very powerful way of building an action that will work with multiple X models. Lastly, it's also offering the configure button method. Now, this is an override that you could just leave it as is, and by default then the magic button will display the caption, that is the caption of this action. So up here you get to set your actions caption and the description and publisher. You know all this from building actions in the past. And generally speaking, if you do nothing else, then this caption, whatever you provide here, will be the caption that's displayed in the Ratchet-X magic button. If you want to override that, like you may want to provide a caption that includes some of the data from the screen, dynamic caption, this is where you'd put that code. And you could also use the show property to determine whether or not this should be shown at all. Maybe when the magic button drops down, you have certain requirements of what fields you need, and you might want to test those requirements and determine that the mandatory fields that are required are not there, so you're not even going to offer your action. You do that here in the context show as part of the running of the configure button method. So that is essentially the Start By mapping structure. Okay? So what we have to implement today is we have to have our main script. Now, as you know, it's a convention here to have your actions start with a main script, and that's kind of the single point that all of your different start by scenarios ultimately feed into the main script. This is entirely up to you. If you want to call it something else, or if you want to do your actual implementations within your start by methods, that's perfectly fine. As a convention, this is the way we do it because it's a clean handoff to say, regardless of whether my application was started in test mode, or was started by a snaggle, or it was started by a mapping, at the core of my action, I really want to do one thing. In this case, for today's demo, we're going to be building a Skype dialer, and the Skype dialer is going to dial a phone number that's provided, regardless of the means by which that phone number was attained. So if the phone number was obtained by a snaggle of a screen by a user, well, that's fine, we're going to get a phone number. If that phone number was obtained by a mapping to our X model that contains a phone number, then fine, that's the phone number we're going to use. If that phone number came from a file that was parsed using the start by file interface, then fine, we're going to use that same phone number. So in other words, it's generally a good practice to have your main script structured in such a way so that the individual start by scenarios are simply feeders that get at the data given that specific start by scenario, and then once the data is obtained, passing it right into your main script, and from then on it's always the same. But again, that's just our view of the way these things usually work. Let's call it a best practice. It's certainly up to you to decide how to code it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to force you to watch me implement this. What I will do is I will open a pre-existing file. There we go. No. I'm going to open a pre-existing file. Now this is essentially the same file with the same sections, but what I've done here is I've already implemented everything that needs to be implemented. So I've given it an appropriate caption, description, publisher. I've set the hide action window and skip action sounds to true. So all this is done. My start by test interface is really going to just provide a hard-coded value. So if I want to test this and see how my Skype dialer works, my test scenario is just going to pass in a hard-coded phone number to dial. And my start by mapping implementation is a little more substantial. Now let's talk about this. What I have done is I have created an X model, and I've stored that X model on one of my web servers. And that X model has essentially only one X model element, which is called phone number, or maybe just phone. I think that's the essential X model element is phone. So that's a very simple X model. I've stored it there. And now I've gone here and I've put into my required mappings that my start by mapping interface is going to work with any app space that has this for a mapping, that is mapping this specific URL's X model. That's the point of abstraction. Okay? So Ratchet-X at runtime will explore any of the app spaces that it has, and it will check to see if any of those are mapped to this exact X model. If so, Ratchet-X will essentially broker the two, and when the magic button is displayed, Ratchet-X will say, yes, this action is available to be run. I've also built a little implementation of the configure button so that it actually will display the phone number in the caption. So it'll say dial the phone number. That's what it'll display in the magic button. And I've set up a couple of other things. I've just made sure that if the phone number is null or empty, then it will not show. So we will not display any action. We will not display our action if the phone number is blank. Okay? Now this is for a later implementation in case we're not using this interface. If we're not started by the mapping interface, then we're just going to use a hard-coded caption like dial a phone number. And you'll see how that becomes relevant later. Okay, now let's take a look at our main script. Our main script is very simple in this case. I kept it that way because I don't want to get into all the details about how to integrate with Skype. That's an entirely other discussion. So what I've done is I have built a Skype dialer, compiled it as a .NET assembly, and I've made it and the files that are required available through the embedded files dialog. So I've included that Skype controller DLL here, and there is an interop component that I have to use as ship as well. And I've included both of them in the list of embedded files so that they become part of my action file. And then they will get extracted as needed at runtime. So this will allow me to use the Skype controller namespace, which you see here. And that gives me access to the main method that I need. I have an object in there called Skype dialer, which has a method called dial, and I just pass it the phone number. So essentially, the only thing my action is going to do is it's going to receive a context object, which is passed into all start by scenarios, and it's going to have the value. Now, this value is the phone number. Regardless of which interface has been started, the job of each one of my interface methods is just to, based on that interface method, extract the phone number that we want to dial. And then they will all roads lead to this main script method, and we'll dial that phone number. So the first step I'm going to do is just remove any characters that are not part of the phone number, that are not digits essentially. I'll strip them all out and create a new value called phone number, and that's the actual digit-only version of the phone number. And I'm going to pass that into the Skype controller, Skype dialer's dial method. Then I'm going to return success. It's really that easy. Okay, we compile clean, and I think we're ready to give this a test. Now let's remember, when I go into Ratchet-X and I click the execute button here within the action editor, the interface that will be called to start this is the start by test interface. And as I've said, the start by test interface will use a specific hard-coded phone number and just make sure that everything is working okay. So let me give that a shot. Let's see what happens. Okay, I get my little dialer. It dials out.
Thank you for calling AI.
All right, there we go. I've just made my first call using the Skype integration. Shut this down. And we've determined that this works just fine from our start by test scenario. So now let's move on and see how this works from our start by mapping scenario. Now if you remember, I have an X model, and that X model URL is what we're going to have to go and build an app space, build a RegWin, and map to this X model URL. I'll go get that done and I'll show you how it looks. Okay, so offline I have just built an app space. Didn't want to waste all your time watching this. You've seen this enough. So I built one app space that has one RegWin, which is the People tab of our sample application, My CRM. Now that sample application has some phone numbers, so it's very convenient. And I didn't even actually build this. I just used import RegWin, and I imported it from our sample app space for My CRM. But what I have done is I've gone to the mappings section, and I have added the mappings that we need, where I'm specifying that the home phone number here, that the home phone snippet is going to be mapped to as a phone number using that X model URL. So what I've essentially done is I've abstractly mapped this specific app space to the X model that is provided by the action. I've also mapped the mobile phone number is mapped as a phone number to dial, and in this case the work phone number is also been mapped. Now I just want to point out that in this particular case I've created an X model that is essentially a very generic X model. Generally speaking, an X model is created to have a one-to-one relationship with an action, where your action will define one X model that it works with. In this case, I didn't do that. What I did is I created a generic X model, with the argument that maybe down the road I might have other actions that I could write that would also have as an input a phone number. And given that scenario, maybe there'd be some value in actually abstracting the X model from the action. That's a little more advanced than I would normally get into in the real world. I just wanted to demonstrate that it's possible. So you could imagine having X models that represent complex data like addresses and things like that, like postal addresses and zip codes and phone numbers. You can imagine having a common set of them that are shared by multiple actions. That certainly could work, and this would be an example of where that might be helpful because it is such a generic piece of data that we're working with. Okay, so now that I have an appropriate RegWin that is mapped to the same X model that my action is looking for, I can leave the action editor, the app space editor, and I can leave the action editor. I can close that as well. We will just get the opportunity here to make changes. Since we have made changes to those assets, we're going to say yes, that we do want Ratchet-X itself to reload all of them. And then we'll take a look and we'll see how this works. Okay, so the first thing you've seen is that, well, apparently, let me just go and show you that I have already set up the app space pointing to the Skype dialer, and the phone dialer demo is here. And there is the magic button. So everything seems to be working fine at the moment. Let me click the magic button. I get the drop down. And let me tell you what we're looking at here. Well, first of all, as you know, we created the Start by Mapping interface, and that's what's being used here. And as we had shown in the action code, we're actually dynamically taking the phone numbers, that one, I'm right-clicking, that one, and we're making them part of the caption. So those are the three that are being implemented now by the I Start By mapping. This one down here, we're jumping the gun a little. I've also implemented the I Start By RegWin, which we're going to show next. So we'll get back to this interface in a moment. But anyway, so this is what we have here. So if I wanted to dial this phone number, I would just select here, and let's see what happens. Ratchet-X whirls for a second. More than a second. There we go. So I'm going to hang that up. And that worked just fine. So now we have this specific phone number being dialable from the magic button drop-down. If I like, I could also create a shortcut. I can go into my app space, and I could create a shortcut that points to this specific field. And that would allow me to either have a user click, like perhaps Control-D to dial when the user is in this field, or some type of a mouse click, like maybe Control-double-click, or even just double-click. And when the user then performs that mouse action over this field, that will also trigger the calling of that action as it relates to that mapping. All right? So that's our first Start By interface. I Start By mapping. Let's move on to the next. Okay, so let's get back into our action editor. And let's open up our action, and let's add an Start By interface. So this is the action that we were just using, which has just Start By test and Start By mapping. Now, I can add an additional Start By interface by just typing it here. It's just code. I put a comma and I Start By RegWin, and then I can implement myself the specific methods and properties that are required in that interface. But I've put in a little convenience here for you. Once this is compiled properly, let's make sure it compiles, I can always choose this icon here, which adds a Start By interface to my code for me. Now what it'll do is it'll analyze my code, and it'll determine which Start By interfaces I have not yet implemented, and it will give me a list of those. The next one we're going to do is Start by RegWin. So if I select this and choose OK, Ratchet-X will automatically add the iStart by RegWin interface here, and then it'll add a code region that contains the implementation of it, or let's call it a stub implementation, that gets me started. So I'm going to click OK. And as you can see, we now have iStart by RegWin added. And we also have iStart by RegWin as a code region. Let's take a quick look at that. The iStart by RegWin interface requires that I implement Start by RegWin, which is the starting point, which is past the action context, and a RegWin info object. Now that contains all the information about the RegWin that this is bound to. Okay? And obviously the Start by RegWin needs to be implemented and then return some type of action result object, letting Ratchet-X know whether it was success or a failure. You also have to implement required RegWins. In this case, these are the RegWins that you need to have available, the one or more RegWins that you will list here, and any one of those RegWins, if found, Ratchet-X will place a magic button on any one of those RegWins that you list here. So it is a list, a string array, and you can provide one or more RegWins. Customarily, this is only one, but you can make it multiples. If you wanted to write one action that can be started on multiple RegWins, then you could certainly include multiple RegWins here. Now this is a tricky part because what it's asking you for here is the RegWin key. Now the RegWin key is not the same as the RegWin's URL, like the URL to the app space. It's actually a string, although it is a URI. It's a string that's contained within the app space. So let me show it to you. I'm going to load the app space editor real quick. This is a common mistake people make. I'm going to load the Skype dialer app space that we've been working with. And I'll go to the People tab. That's the one that we want to connect to. And you'll see right here is your RegWin key. I usually just grab this, Control C, copy it to the clipboard, and then from there, I just go here and I add it here. That's it. Okay? So from this point on, this particular action can be started by that RegWin. Okay? Now remember, there's a one-to-one relationship. So there may be mappings on that RegWin. There may not be mappings. Ratchet-X is not guaranteeing anything like that. What Ratchet-X is doing is saying that every time a RegWin that has this RegWin key is found on screen, Ratchet-X will offer a magic button and allow your action to be run from that magic button. Okay? So, what I'm going to do now is, we've already got the implementations for test and mapping. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do the implementation for Start by RegWin. That should not require any changes to the main script. They should be fine just as is. And let me just do that now. I'll do that offline and I'll come right back. Okay, so I have the implementation required. My Start by RegWin method is now got its implementation in here. And let's just review what it is. Start by RegWin is called past the context object and the RegWin in question. In this case, it's the RegWin for People tab. And you'll notice now my action is aware of that. It's aware of the fact that there are fields on there, snippets, called home phone, mobile phone, and work phone. Okay? So now that you see those values hard-coded, those are names of snippets contained within that app space. So this is when I say that now my action is directly bound. It has knowledge of a specific app space. That's what I mean. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to prompt the end user when the Start by RegWin action is started. I'm going to pop up a little user interface using our built-in prompt for choice. And I'm going to ask the user to select home, mobile, or work phone. They're actually selecting a snippet. Okay, and putting up a header, some header and a little description. And assuming that they actually select one and don't click cancel, I'm going to then call the main script method, passing in the context, and the main script method expects me to pass in a string value that is the phone number. Well, I'm going to get that by using the RegWin info object that's passed into my method. And I'm going to call the getSnippet method, and pass in the snippet that the user selected. Now remember, this snippet here is really just a string value. So it's going to pass in the value home phone or mobile phone, whatever the user selected. And then that snippet, I'm going to call its extract method, which will actually do an extraction from the screen and get the live value that's connected to that screen at runtime. Okay? And then from that point on, it's just calling the same main script method that you see here. Okay? Same basic thing. So nothing has changed there. So as you can see now, you're starting to get a sense that really each one of these start by scenarios are just acting as a specific feeder to feed information from that particular start by scenario in. So when we're starting by RegWin, we want to actually get access to the snippet called home phone or mobile phone, whatever the user selects, and we're going to extract data from it, and that's how we're going to do our phone dialing. Okay. So let's try this out and see how this works in. Let's try this out and see how this works in Ratchet-X Commander. Now you've kind of seen this before because the action that I've got registered here actually contains all of the completed interfaces. So this is displaying itself here in the dial a phone number. That is actually the Start by RegWin interface in action. Okay, that's why there's only one. There's only one RegWin, and therefore there's only one alert showing me that I can run a specific action. But when I click this, it will call the I Start by RegWin interface. So let's see what happens. Okay, first thing Ratchet-X does is it calls its little prompter, and it asks the user to select one of these phone numbers. So let's take the mobile phone number and give that a dial. Double click. And there we go. Hang up real quick, not to bother anybody. And that's it. Now we've seen that second interface called and basically performing the same service, feeding that phone number that's come in through that start by interface into the main script for processing. Okay? So that's in essence the start by RegWin scenario. Very valuable and quite often used. Okay, next we'll be implementing the Start by Snaggle interface, and that's a little different. That's the first example that we have of starting our action when there is no RegWin or mapping that is triggering it. So the Ratchet-X magic button doesn't necessarily have to be present. This can happen without any RegWin in place. So let me go into our action editor. And let's take a look at how to build this one. Okay, so I will open where we left off, and I think that was with this one. Mapping and RegWin already implemented. Well, once again, I'm going to add a new interface. I could just go over here and do it manually, or I can click, well, after compiling, I can click the Add Start By Interface. And I'm presented with a list of those interfaces I have not yet used in my action. I'll start with the Start by Snaggle. Click OK. And as you can see, the Start by Snaggle interface has been added, and the Start by Snaggle code region has been added. So let's explore into this a little bit and see what it does. Well, obviously, we have the Start by Snaggle method. That's the entry point into our action when a snaggle has been used to run it. It's passed the action context object and the Snaggle info object. So the Snaggle info object contains a number of things. Among them is the actual screen scraped value that the user selected. So in the example, what we're going to do today, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have the user be able to go up to some screen that they're not that they have no RegWin for, and effectively be able to hit Control F12 or whatever they'd like to assign to their Snaggle key, and Ratchet-X would have a global hook, detect that event, and screen scrape the screen that they're looking at, and go through the text that's returned and compare it to the regular expressions that are provided here. And this is where we'd be providing our regular expression patterns. So really what we're going to do is, I'm going to implement this now, and then we'll talk a little bit more. Let me do that. Okay, I'm back. Let's maximize this. All right, so really in this scenario, there's very little that I have to do. All I've had to do is I've had to add a regular expression. For those of you not familiar with regular expressions, here they're just handled as a string, but in this string in this particular case is very primitive implementation here. It's just essentially saying look for any 3 digits followed by a dash, and then 3 digits followed by a dash, and then 4 digits, or look for 3 digits followed by a dot, 3 digits followed by a dot, and then 4 digits, or, and it just goes on. This is a relatively primitive way of doing a regular expression. I don't really want to focus on the merit of the regular expression for the moment. That's for a later discussion. But clearly what we have to do here is provide the regular expression value. And remember, we can provide multiple patterns. So this is just one. And in my one pattern, I've provided really the 3 variations I'm expecting. But I could equally create a number of these patterns. And what will happen is, when Ratchet-X finds a match and it passes in this Snaggle info object, let me just show you what the Snaggle info object contains. It contains the pattern that was found. Well, that's important. So if you are using multiple patterns, you'll know which particular pattern was being used. It returns the value that was found. In this case, it would be the phone number. And it provides the match object. That's the regular expression match object that .NET uses. This gives you a lot of capability here to potentially go in and use match groups and use more advanced regular expression features to harness the real power of regular expressions to subparse this into sub-elements if you would like. In this case, it's not necessary. All we want to do is just grab the entire value that's been snaggled and pass that value into our main script. So let's save this and take a look at it running in action. Let's close this. And we're going to reload. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Commander, and I'm going to go to my Tools Options. I'm going to make sure I know what the Snaggle key is that's defined. All right, we have a Snaggle key defined here. And in this case, I'm going to use Control F12 as my Snaggle. And there's an override mode, similar to Magic Button Override. What this does is it allows you to set kind of an auto launch mode, where if only one Snaggle value is found on screen, then instead of presenting the user with a choice, it will just automatically run the action for that value. I'm going to leave it at standard overrides for the moment. And I'm also going to remove our app space. Okay. By removing this app space, it removes the magic button recognition, and now I can use the same screen and demonstrate how, in the absence of an app space and a RegWin, I could still call that same action. I'll also do it on another screen just to further explore it. So now I've got Ratchet-X open, and I'm going to click here. With focus in the My CRM app, I'm going to hit Control F12 and watch what happens. Okay, what you just heard was a chirp that lets you know, okay, Ratchet-X is in action. You saw kind of a haze appear over the application, and it said snaggling. And now you see kind of a haze, a lighter haze still over the application, and the values that meet our requirements, our pattern, are highlighted here in yellow. As I highlight over each, you can see what the action is that will run when clicked. And if I would click anywhere else or hit any other key, it just goes away. So it's kind of, once it's launched, I'll do it again, Control F12. Once it's launched, if you click this, it will actually run the action. If you click anywhere else or hit any other key, it will just abandon ship. So it's kind of lightweight, tries to get out of your way if you didn't intentionally do it. Okay, so let me run it by clicking on Home. And there we go. It's dialing that number. Okay. So that is essentially what a snaggle is. One more time. I hit Control F12 or whatever the snaggle key is configured for. We do a screen scrape of the screen, compare it to the regular expressions that you have supplied in your Start By Snaggle interface. We highlight those values that we found, and by clicking on them, we'll actually launch your action and pass that value, as well as the screen coordinates of where it's found, as well as the regular expression match object itself, so you can do some further analysis if you want. And your action can basically do whatever it wants. In this case, it's just going to dial the phone. Okay? Great. So let's move on. Okay, moving right along, we're going to go back into our development environment, load the action editor. And now we're going to implement the Start By file interface. So let me load up where I was, where I had the three interfaces, mapping, RegWin, and Snaggle, all completed. Okay, so now I would do the same thing. Either manually I would add my Start By file interface, or after a clean compile, I can use this little button, and it shows me that the only two that I have not yet implemented is Start By User and Start By File. So I'll do Start By File. And there we go. So let me just maximize this so we can see it a little bit better. And you can see Start By File has been added here. And its stub implementation is available here in a code region. And what I'm going to do now is I just simply have to implement a little bit of code here that will prompt the user to select one of any of the possible phone numbers that I find in the file that's passed in. So the Start By File method will receive the context object, as it always does, and a string array of file paths. So I'm going to write a little bit of code that is going to look through those file paths, open up the files, and extract all the text, and then go through all of that text. Probably what I'll do is I'll use the regular expressions that are already provided here in the Start By Snaggle interface, and I will use those regular expressions to search for text in those files, and then I will prompt the user to select one or more of the any available phone numbers. So let me do that. I'll do that offline. I'll be right back. Okay, so let's take a look at this method. I have Start By File here, and in a very simple way, the first thing I'm going to do is check to make sure all the files exist, and if those files exist, I will copy the text from those files into a string that I'm calling all file text. Then I'm going to go through, and for each of the required patterns, now you'll notice this required patterns is actually dependent on using the Start By Snaggle interface. So because I've already got these patterns listed there, I'm just reusing those patterns for this interface as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a regex, a regular expression, and check to see if I find any matches. If I find matches, I will add those values, presumably phone numbers, into my phone number list. If my phone number list is 0, I'll just provide a message that says I can't find any phone numbers in the file. If not, I will actually use the prompt for choice, as I did in one of the earlier examples, and I will be providing the phone list. The phone list of phone numbers will be what the user will select from, so they'll get a list of the valid phone numbers. And then, if they select nothing, I will cancel it. And if not, we're ready to go. I will pass in the selected phone number into the main script. And as you can see, this is just another example of the Start By method doing nothing more than handling the location of the data vis-a-vis that specific Start By scenario and letting the bulk of the work be done in the main script method. Okay? So let me see if this gets a clean compile. It does. So let's just shut this down, and let's see this work in action. Now, this is independent of my CRM, so I'll close that for the moment. I have created, I believe, a list here. Okay, I've created a phone numbers.txt file, which contains a couple of phone numbers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop that into the Ratchet-X action. Okay, this would trigger, notice it goes hot, I am able to drop it. This would trigger the Ratchet-X would receive this file and would pass it into the start by file interface for our action. I let go, our action runs. First thing it does is it prompts me for the phone numbers that are found in that file. And if I double click any of them, it does what it's been doing all the time, which is essentially dialing the Skype dialer for that phone number.
Thank you for calling.
Okay? All right. That's it for start by file. Very simple, right? Let's move on to iStart by user interface. That's our last one. So let me go to Tools, load the Action Editor. And all right, so let's open up, see where we were before. That's where we were before. We had all the interfaces done but one. And what I would do is I'd compile it. Once it knows it's got a clean compile, it does offer the start by interface. And the last one in our list, and then we've done them all, is the start by user. So if I choose that and click OK, then what you'll see is iStart by user is now available. That's been added to our list. And we've put in the stub implementation here of start by user. And you'll notice start by user only receives a context object. There's nothing else. There's no file, there's no RegWin, there's no Snaggle, there's really no other information. This is just started by the user. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just put in a phone number. Let's just do this real quick. Let's say return main script. I'll pass in the context, and the value I'll pass in is a specific phone number. And in this case, I'm just going to have it launch the dialer and dial a hard-coded phone number. You can really have it do whatever you want, but I think this is relatively easy and straightforward. The point here is that the start by user interface starts without any guarantees from Ratchet-X that any RegWins are found or mappings are found. It just starts with what we consider a blank context. It's, you can do whatever you want inside your action, but don't assume there's any windows open or anything like that because it's been started by the user at the user's discretion. Okay? So let's see this one in action. Okay, so lastly, we're back in Ratchet-X. We've got no app spaces currently loaded, so Ratchet-X is not scanning and searching for any of those. As you can see down here, our RegWin count is 0. They've got no RegWins that we know of. And all I'm going to do is right-click the Action menu. And when I get the Action context menu, you'll see that there is an Execute. Now, you'll always see this Execute menu item, but it'll usually be disabled unless you've implemented the iStart by user interface. So let me just click this and we'll see what happens. There we go. We're dialing our phone number manually. Okay? So that's really it. What we've just done is we have created a little Skype dialer, and that Skype dialer can be invoked many ways. It can be invoked by known RegWins, by virtue of just adding a specific, app space. Let me grab an app space for it. Here's the app space that we've created for it. So given that app space, it can be started by either the iStart by mapping or iStart by RegWin. So you'll notice the magic button appears, and it's offering an alert for each one of the mappings that have been mapped. And each one of those will use the iStart by mapping interface, but it's also offering one for the RegWin, one that's generic, and when I select that one, it would actually run the action, and the action would prompt me for the specific phone number that I want to dial. And it's also, I can hit Control F12 and use the Snaggle method to find specific Snaggle values and start our action that way. It can also be started by dragging and dropping a file onto the action itself or by right-clicking and choosing Execute. Okay, that's a great example of all of the ways that Ratchet-X can be started. And really the idea for you is to take a look at your use case and determine which one of those mechanisms or multiples. Very often actions are written that support multiple ways of doing it. And it's up to you to decide which one of those makes the best sense given your use case. Well, I thank you very much for paying attention, and I hope to talk to you again in later videos.